this understanding of time is part of that, part of the Buddhist idea of right view. And it really does, it makes sense. It starts, well, at least to me it does, it starts off from the premise of the only real time is this moment. And that's sort of, it's difficult to argue about that, I've seen people try to argue about that, but I think any argument against that just falls apart. It's just fundamentally obvious. The only real time is this exact moment, the one we're having right now. And the past is a kind of, it's always memory. It's always just, and memory is not very reliable. Even the best of us can't remember the past all that well, and we make a lot of assumptions and we fill in a lot of gaps and things. And then the future is not, the future is just kind of a supposition about what might happen. And you can kind of get it accurate enough to plan what time you're going to have lunch and when, how long you should cook the potatoes or whatever, things like that. And a lot of things can be planned that way. I mean, I'm always amazed at how when they send these spacecraft out to Jupiter, they you can calculate with precision where this object will be 10 years from now, and then it actually ends up there 10 years from now, if you do it right, and then we get lovely photos of Saturn, or something like that, that just came out a few years ago. I remember when those started streaming in from one of the probes, and it was like, they actually sent this out in 1978 or whatever it was, but now it ended up in Saturn and taking pictures and sending it back, and it worked. So we can do pretty amazing things in terms of calculating what might happen in the future. But it's still just a supposition. It's still just imagination, even those incredibly accurate ones that end up working out well, don't prove that the future really exists in any place. It's the only real moment is now. And so the Buddhists start out with this premise of, okay, the only real moment is now. What does that mean? And what Dogen is saying here is pretty bizarre. So I want to read it again in the version that I like better than, I hate to diss my teacher by using somebody else's version, but I've looked at this in the original Japanese, and I feel like I would probably translate the Japanese more like this than the way they did it. But I think they had their own reasons, Mike Cross and Nishijima Roshi, for translating it the way they did. And that is, I think, that they wanted to present a version of Shogo Genzo that wasn't too mystical sounding, or that had a kind of concreteness to it, that had a kind of like everyday life sort of feel to it, rather than seeming very airy and high off in the clouds. But when I read Dogen, he does seem a little bit off into the clouds sometimes. So that's why I tend to prefer this version that sounds a little bit more cosmic. And here is that version. The self arrays itself and forms the entire universe. Perceive each particular thing in this entire universe as a moment of time. Things do not hinder one another, just as moments do not hinder one another. For this reason, the whole world of time is arousing the way-seeking mind. That's the mind that seeks the truth. The whole world of the mind is arousing time, so time kind of comes out of the mind. The same is true with practice and attaining the way. Thus, the self sets the self out in array and sees itself. This is the understanding that self is time. So, this idea of self is kind of a funny one, and it's one of the things that confuses people when they, if you take like an intro to world religions class and learn about Buddhism, one of the first things they will certainly tell you is that Buddha established this idea of anatman, which is often translated into English as no self. So Atman was an idea. Atman is one of these funny ideas in Hinduism, because when I look at different literature from that tradition, it appears to me to have changed over time. But if you read the Bhagavad Gita, Atman is very clearly described in one section of the Bhagavad Gita as being this kind of immaterial being that lives inside the body somewhere and is separate from the body. And I think there's a line in there about how upon the moment of death, the Atman sheds the body like a person taking off a set of clothing, and then goes off and finds a new body to inhabit. And that's when the Buddha was saying anatman, I think really what he was referencing was that idea. But in the development of Hinduism over time, Atman became a much more cosmic sort of thing. And at that point you find Hinduism and Buddhism are starting to say almost the same thing. So Atman has changed. The word that Dogen uses in his writings is jiko. And jiko is just a very common Japanese word that, like the first place I learned jiko, or learned to use the word jiko, when I was studying Japanese, because I lived over there and I was studying that. Jiko shokai. Jiko shokai is self-introduction. It means, my name is Brad and I come from America, whatever. That's jiko shokai, and it's one of the things you learn early when you're studying Japanese, because you're going to be expected when you get over there to do a lot of jiko shokai. You're going to be introducing yourself to a lot of people, and teachers of Japanese will teach you how to do that. Watashi wa Brado desu, America kara kimashita, and all these phrases that you would learn. My name is Brad, I come from America, and these kind of things you would learn for your jiko shokai. So so the point of that long-winded digression into Japanese is to say that this word he chose to use is not some kind of crazy philosophical word. It's just the word for self, that's just commonly used everywhere. But in his writings, and this is something I just noticed a couple of years ago, and when writing one of my books in which I had to kind of dig into reading Dogen in Japanese, I noticed that he has this tendency to use two different words when he's talking about self. And one is jiko, and the other is ware. And they're both just common Japanese words that mean self. Ware is not used. It was used more in Dogen's time, 800 years ago, to refer to be like I, to be more or less the equivalent of I in Japanese. These days you tend to say watashi, but in those days ware was the word. And when he's saying ware, he is usually referring to this sense of individual self, of me, this individual who does this and that, But when he uses jiko, he's using it to more mean the sort of sense of a self that is the self of the universe. And the idea is that although it appears that all of us in this room have a different self, myself and Rebecca's self and everybody else's self, we're all different selves in this universe, or in this room, and in this universe. That's the appearance, and that's the way we conduct ourselves. But that beneath that, there is just one self. There is only one self of the whole universe that is common to all of us. And Dogen identifies this self with time. And that's the thing I think is real interesting there, because it sets up this way of looking at life, at things that you encounter in life, that's really different from what we're used to. So that he's saying that self and time are the same thing, and we should see, what does he say? I'm going to read the exact words. Perceive each particular thing in this entire universe as a moment of time. So each of us is a moment of time, so that time becomes something different from what we're used to thinking of it as. We think of time as it's 12:21. Actually, I think my watch is a little fast, but it's something like that, and that's the time. But he's saying that time and the difference between this self and all of yourselves is just kind of is like time. So it's like removing the same self and seeing it as time, and that's why we're all separate, which is intriguing to me. I could probably babble on about this for hours of time and waste a lot of your time talking about it. But it is kind of interesting because we know from how physics has progressed in the last few hundred years since Dogen, that we really don't. Simultaneity is kind of an illusion. We have this idea that we're all simultaneously experiencing this event, whatever we're calling this lecture as an event. But it's not completely simultaneous. It's so close in time that it doesn't really matter that much in terms of practical things you might do with it. But you're never hearing my words at exactly the moment they're spoken. There's always this lag. It takes a bit of time to get to you, even though that time is kind of negligible. So you're not hearing them at the same time, and this gets really weird. Sorry to be strange. When you start to look at things in outer space, this is how Einstein came up with that whole idea of relativity, which I cannot claim to understand, but it's sort of based on the understanding fundamentally that if you're looking at a star, the nearest star is 4 light years from Earth, you're never seeing that star as it is now. You can only see it as it was 4 years ago, and there's no way to traverse that distance, at least that we know of, that doesn't take an incredible amount of time. So to talk of a time that is common between here and Alpha Centauri, or however you pronounce it, is kind of is meaningless. You can't really. You might imagine that an alien on Alpha Centauri could be doing something right now at this moment, of time, but because we're so separated from it, we could never perceive that as being simultaneous, even though from the viewpoint of God, we might imagine that there is a simultaneity to these events, but there isn't. It just becomes meaningless. So this is kind of the view that he's going on. Did you start to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say until we get Wi-Fi on that planet.
Yeah, well maybe. But then it would still take a while for the Wi-Fi signal to travel here, I think.
So what's the moment? Is it the experience moment, or is it the point in time?
Well, yeah, what is the moment? In Buddhist terms, the moment of now is too short to be perceived. So even our perceptions, such as they are, can't get at it. That's the weird thing. So even now is kind of hidden from us in terms of perception. Because the brain is even taking time to work things out, so you don't know what's going on at this moment. It's just you're perceiving it. So the idea is that our perceptions are fundamentally unreliable. I mean, they're reliable for practical purposes. You don't want to go so far as to think that you can't do anything. But that if you're trying to get at the reality of things, perception isn't the way to do it. And thinking isn't the way to do it either, because thinking is always based on perception. So, this is where it gets really hairy and strange. Because, there's one thing I want to say, but I have to preface it with something else, which is, the preface is, one thing I really like about Buddhism is that it's not afraid of science. That's what first attracted me. Really, I think that I can consciously remember to Buddhism is I was really trying to find a religious worldview that I could get with, that I could understand. And I kept running into these Christians, and like I said yesterday, I don't think this is all Christians, but the ones I would encounter in rural Ohio when I was a teenager, all were very anti-science. They would be like, wow, yeah, science says there's evolution and dinosaurs, existed and whatever, but really the Bible says there was a flood and the earth was created 6,000 years ago or whatever, and Adam and Eve and all this. You have to believe that, and there's a rejection of science. Having said that, for Buddhism, science kind of is acceptable in where it functions, but where it functions is in the area of perception and thinking about things perceived. So science can function very well when it comes to what humans are able to perceive and how we think about those perceptions logically. And it's great, and you can do wonderful things by working that all out, and we shouldn't reject it. But at the same time, science isn't able to get to reality. The reality is kind of forever hidden from that way of looking at things, because that all has to do with perception. Perception has limits. And so what the Buddhists say, I sometimes like to talk about the Buddhists as if they're somebody else, because it just works for me better that way. But what they would say is that intuition is the thing that is more reliable than perception or than thinking, and that the best way to act is in an intuitive way. So you just kind of get an intuition about the situation that you're in, and an intuition about the right way to respond to that situation, and that's much more reliable. The danger in that, I think, and probably the reason we do zazen, or one of the reasons we do zazen, is you don't want to just mistake intuition for a kind of habitual response, which is easy to do, because that guy called me an asshole, so I'm going to punch him. That would be a habitual response that you might mistake for intuition, but that's not intuition. Intuition is something that's much more. It's clearer than that in a way. And part of the practice of zazen is to get the mind quiet enough to be able to recognize intuition when it occurs. So something like that.